Hello and welcome to the brand new Off the Beaten Tracks. It's a new day, a new channel, and a new me with better hair and lighting. So I have this other channel, My Vinyl Attic, which features almost all Canadian content. Link is below. I have literally thousands of Canadian albums, and my intention was to showcase Canadian recordings from the very best the country has ever put out to the most obscure content imaginable. But a problem has arisen like turds from a submarine. Basic and oh so human greed, ladies and gentlemen. For whatever reason, my new channel at present is getting 10 to 50 times the views as my old channel, which is this channel. Then I started hearing about algorithms and how if you actually put up something a little out there or interesting, your once verdant YouTube oasis will instantly transmogrify into a bleached and acrid desert of loneliness and despair. Well, shit. What am I going to do with all my Toronto high school and church recordings from the 60s and 70s? How do I dig myself out of this pernicious and unyielding need for affirmation on the world's largest streaming platform? And then a light from a distant star shone, and thus I was guided to this place. Here, my old channel where I can do whatever the fuck I want. And here is my kiln-fired promise, ladies and gentlemen. Off the Beaten Track will not capitulate to the base need of actually having people watch my meticulously sewn-together videos. I'm going to play fantastic music, but I'm also going to feature jaw-dropping oddities that 4 people and possibly the artist's mother might watch. Or not. Now all I had to do was figure out which piece of musical obscure to begin the off-the-beaten-track self-defeating march to 0 views. Something that will have that devil-sent and seductive algorithm disoriented and gasping for air. And here it is. And it's not even music, but it is Canadiana. 1967 marked the 100th year of Canada's existence as a country, and to commemorate this century-long milestone, the Ontario Board of Education produced a record. There are instructions on the back to the teacher on how to mete out this patriotic treat to their enraptured students, and those went a little something like this.
It is suggested that the optimum usefulness of this record may be achieved if the class hears it only after careful preparation has been completed. The teacher should become thoroughly familiar with the record before playing it to the students. It is not advisable to play the record in its entirety, but rather in meaningful segments. A suitable map of Canada should be clearly visible to all pupils as the record is played. The teacher may wish to use supplemental visual materials, such as selected portraits from the Fathers of Confederation portfolio, or suitable items from the Portfolio of Historical Flags of Canada. Many readily available books and periodicals contain pictorial material relating to the Confederation conferences of Charlottetown, Quebec, and London, and the Dominion Day celebrations in Ottawa and other Canadian communities. The teacher should become familiar with the material which follows in order to provide the necessary background to the students.
So keep all that in mind because you're about to become thoroughly and irreversibly acquainted with Canada's sometimes painful birth, and I hope you like actors talking in Scottish accents.
A tall, stern-faced Scot, with red hair and button-chop whiskers, elegantly dressed, stands before a map of North America. He is George Brown, Liberal leader in Canada West, owner and editor of the Globe newspaper. He speaks to the Canadian legislature. The year is 1865.
Look, sir, at the map of the continent of America, and mark that island, Newfoundland, commanding the mouth of the noble river that almost cuts our continent in twain. Well, sir, that island is equal in extent to the kingdom of Portugal. Cross the straits to the mainland, and you touch the hospitable shores of Nova Scotia, a country as large as the kingdom of Greece. Then mark the sister province of New Brunswick, equal in extent to Denmark and Switzerland combined. Pass up the river St. Lawrence to Lower Canada, a country as large as France. Pass on to Upper Canada, 20,000 square miles larger than Great Britain and Ireland put together. Cross over the continent to the shores of the Pacific, and you are in British Columbia, the land of golden promise, equal in extent to the Austrian Empire. I speak not now of the vast Indian territories that lie between, greater in extent than the whole soil of Russia, and that will, ere long, I trust, be opened up to civilization under the auspices of the British-American Confederation. Well, sir, the bold scheme in your hands is nothing less than to gather all these countries into one, to organize them all under one government, with the protection of the British flag, and in heartiest sympathy and affection with our fellow subjects in the land that gave us birth.
Let us imagine that there were planes in 1861, and that we are in an Air Canada jet high above Prince Edward Island, flying west. British North America is spread out below us like a map. From our place in the sky, we see great rivers, vast untraveled stretches of highland and lowland, lakes as big as inland seas, prairies whose wealth is just beginning to be suspected, and mighty mountain ranges as glorious as any in the world. Where are the people who possess all this land? There are not many to lay claim to it all. Let us suppose that on the great map which lies below us, one dot of light represents 1,000 resident people. There are 805 lights, nearly all on the shoreline, showing on Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. These lights represent about a quarter of the population of British North America. The lights cluster more thickly as we fly over Canada East, now Quebec, and Canada West, Ontario. 2,485 lights here, scattered farther, too, from the water's edge. They represent 2,500,000 persons, about three-quarters of all the people in British North America. Not many lights through the prairies, and not many more on the coast. From the western tip of Lake Superior to the Pacific, just a small fraction of the whole population of our country in 1861. It is an enormous inheritance for such a handful of people. They have a rich, populous, and powerful neighbor to the south of them. In the past, prominent Americans have often declared that the whole of the North American continent must someday belong to the United States. Now some of them are again loudly demanding the annexation of British America. The great Civil War has broken out between the North and the South in the Republic, and relations between the North on the one hand and Great Britain and British North America on the other have grown steadily worse. The Trent affair brought England and the North to the brink of war. The losses caused by the Alabama, a Southern cruiser built in Britain, have caused another serious dispute between the two countries. What will happen when the Civil War is over? If the North wins, it may turn on British North America in the flush of victory. If the South wins, the North may seek compensation for its losses north of the border. British Americans have begun to realize the need for defense, and the truth that the best defense lies in union. But the vision of a great united British North America was far older than the American Civil War. For a number of reasons, Canadians had come to believe that now was the time to make the dream come true. The two divisions of the province of Canada, Canada East and Canada West, had found it very hard to work together. A continuous sectional conflict left the two political parties, conservatives and reformers, nearly equal in the Assembly, and made effective government almost impossible. Canada West was particularly annoyed by this state of affairs, for though its population far outnumbered that of Canada East, it had exactly the same representation in the Assembly. In the end, federal union had seemed the only answer to this chronic deadlock. But what kind of federal union was it to be? A federation of the two Canadas, or a confederation of all of British North America? If the Canadians could persuade the Maritimes to join them, and if together they could take over Rupert's Land and the Pacific coast, they would possess a boundless treasury of natural resources and an immense common market. An intercolonial railway would link Canada and the Atlantic provinces. A Pacific railway would bring in the great Northwest and British Columbia. No real move out of the stalemate was made until the summer of 1864. On the 14th of June, still another government, the government of John A. Macdonald and Etienne Taché, was defeated in the Assembly by 2 votes. In this new crisis, George Brown, the Liberal leader of Canada West, made one of the great dramatic gestures in Canadian history. He was convinced that his own Canada West was the chief loser and sufferer from the sectional conflict. He had long been demanding constitutional reform in Canada. He let it be known through two conservative backbenchers, Morris and Pope, that he would be willing to support any government that was prepared to settle Canada's constitutional troubles. John A. Macdonald, the conservative leader of Canada West, responded quickly to Brown's invitation. A tall, genial man with a big nose and bushy, dark hair, Macdonald, like Brown, was weary of the disappointments of Canadian politics. 6 years earlier, he and George Cartier, the conservative leader of Canada East, had suggested a federal union of all the British North American provinces. But this proposal had not been welcomed in either Great Britain or the Maritime provinces, and it had come to nothing. For the last year and more, Macdonald had often thought of retiring from politics. But now he saw that George Brown's offer of cooperation might change everything. With the help of Brown and his supporters, he might realize the dream of a united transcontinental British-American kingdom. He decided that he would accept Brown's offer. On Thursday, June 16th, as the afternoon session opened, Mr. Macdonald spoke to Mr. Brown.
I've been informed of your statements to Mr. Morris and Mr. Pope. Would you have any objection to meeting Mr. Galt and discussing the matter?
Certainly not.
On Friday, Mr. Macdonald and Mr. Galt called on Mr. Brown at the St. Louis Hotel. Mr. Brown explained his reasons for this extraordinary meeting of political opponents.
Nothing but the extreme urgency of the present crisis and the hope of settling the sectional troubles of the province forever, gentlemen, could justify our meeting together with a view to common political action.
Sir, on this footing alone, we have invited this meeting. We are charged by our colleagues to invite your aid in strengthening the administration with a view to the settlement of the sectional difficulties of Upper and Lower Canada.
What does the government propose as a remedy for the injustice complained of by Upper Canada, and as a settlement of the sectional troubles?
Our remedy is a federal union of all the British North American provinces.
I believe that a federation of all the provinces ought to come, aye, and it will come ere long, but it has not yet been thoroughly considered by the people. And even were this otherwise, there are so many parties to be considered that its adoption is uncertain and remote.
What is your remedy?
The measure acceptable to Upper Canada would be parliamentary reform based on population.
It's impossible for us to accede, or for any government to carry such a measure. Unless a basis can be found in the federative principle, it doesn't seem likely that anything can be settled.
After much discussion on both sides, it was found that a compromise might probably be had in the adoption either of the federal principle for all the British North American provinces as the larger question, or for Canada alone, with provision for the admission of the Maritime provinces and the Northwestern Territory when they should express the desire.
The government are prepared to pledge themselves to bring in a measure next session for the purpose of removing existing difficulties by introducing the federal principle into Canada, coupled with such provision as will permit the Maritime provinces and the Northwest Territory to be incorporated into the same system of government. And the government will seek, by sending representatives to the lower provinces and to England, to secure the assent of those interests which are beyond the control of our own legislation, to such a measure as may enable all British North America to be united under a general legislature based upon the federal principle.
Hundreds of miles away from the province of Canada, down the Great St. Lawrence and into the Gulf, the men of the Maritimes were planning a meeting to discuss uniting the three maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Little Prince Edward Island. It would have one provincial legislature and government. The thought of Canada was not in their minds. But the thought of the Maritimes was firmly in the minds of the Canadians. On the very day that the coalition was formed, Lord Monck, the Governor-General, had written to the maritime governors asking permission for Canada to send a delegation to the Conference on Maritime Union. The Canadians were invited to come, but only unofficially, as guests or onlookers. It was a great day for Charlottetown, the 1st of September, 1864. The sleepy little island capital had been roused from its slumbers by the coming of its first circus in 20 years. Bands and banners, clowns and acrobats, wild animals and performing dogs paraded through the town. The streets were full of people wandering happily about in their best clothes. The hotels and boarding houses were full of visitors. Among these visitors were the delegates from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, who had come to attend the Conference on Maritime Union. There were 5 Nova Scotians headed by Charles Tupper, a medical doctor who was premier of the province. Premier Tilley led a second delegation of 5 from New Brunswick. Their hosts were Colonel John Hamilton Gray of Prince Edward Island and 4 other island politicians. The members of each delegation had been chosen from both government and opposition parties. They had discussed maritime union for some time. Nova Scotia liked the idea. New Brunswick wasn't sure that it did, and Prince Edward Island hated the thought of losing its own legislature. Nobody had come prepared with a plan for a union. They were simply going to discuss the proposal. But they had no chance to discuss it on that 1st of September, 1864. Before the conference was officially organized, the exciting news that the Canadians had arrived spread through Charlottetown. W.H. Pope, the provincial secretary of Prince Edward Island, who had been asked to greet the visitors, hurried down to the wharf. He saw a strange vessel anchored some way out in the harbor. But Pope knew that it was none other than the Queen Victoria, the Canadian government vessel that was to bring the Canadians to Charlottetown for the conference. He must go out to greet them, and no suitable boat was in sight. Very distastefully, for Mr. Pope was an elegant and somewhat fussy man, he hailed a fisherman in a disreputable flat-bottomed tub with a cargo of a barrel of flour and 2 jars of molasses. The fisherman rowed the provincial secretary out toward the Queen Victoria, and Pope welcomed the visitors with what dignity he could muster. There were 8 Canadians with their secretaries. Among them were John A. Macdonald, Attorney General, Canada West; George Brown; Alexander Galt, the Minister of Finance; D'Arcy McGee, Minister for Agriculture; and George Cartier, Attorney General, Canada East. George Brown's wife, Anne, reads her husband's account of the adventure to Charlottetown.
We had great fun coming down the St. Lawrence, having fine weather, a broad awning to recline under, excellent stores of all kinds, an unexceptionable cook, lots of books, chessboards, backgammon, and so forth. I was up at 4 in the morning to see the sunrise and have a saltwater bath. Amid most beautiful scenery, we came suddenly on the capital city of the island. Our steamer dropped anchor magnificently in the stream, and its man-of-war cut evidently inspired the natives with huge respect for their big brothers from Canada. I flatter myself we did that well. Having dressed ourselves in correct style, our 2 boats were lowered man-of-war fashion, and being each duly manned with 4 oarsmen and a boatswain, dressed in blue uniform, hats, belts, etc., in regular style, we pulled away for shore. We came unofficially to discuss the propriety of extending their scheme and seeing whether the whole of British North America could not be included in one government. The conference was accordingly organized without us, but that being done, we were formally invited to be present, and were presented in great style to the conference. Having gone through the shake elbow and the howdy-do and the fine weather, the conference adjourned to the next morning at 10 to meet for the serious dispatch of business. In the evening, the governor, Mr. Dundas, gave a large dinner party to as many of the party as he could conveniently receive, I being one. Next morning,
The delegates in Charlottetown worked from 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. On Friday, John A. Macdonald and George Cartier explained the general arguments in favor of Confederation. On Saturday, Alexander Galt described the financial arrangements of the Federation. When the conference adjourned that day, the Queen Victoria became a banquet hall.
we all proceeded on board our steamer, and the members were entertained at luncheon in princely style. Cartier and I made eloquent speeches, of course, and whether as a result of our eloquence or of the goodness of our champagne, the ice became completely broken. The tongues of the delegates wagged merrily, and the banns of matrimony between all the provinces of British North America having been formally proclaimed, and no man appeared to forbid the banns, The Union was thereupon formally completed and proclaimed.
George Brown took the whole of the Monday sitting to speak of the constitutional aspects of Confederation, the way in which the general government and the local governments should be constructed, and what duties each should assume. Tuesday was given over to general discussion, and on Wednesday the conference gave the Canadians their answer.
They were unanimous in regarding federation of all the provinces to be highly desirable, if the terms of union could be made satisfactory, and that they were prepared to waive their own more limited question until the details of our scheme could be more fully considered and matured. It was agreed that the conference should stand adjourned until Monday the 12th of September, then to meet at Halifax.
When the parleying in Charlottetown was over for the day, there were déjeuners, dinners, balls, excursions, and picnics. One day, a small flotilla of rowboats, billowing with crinolines, moved over the water, and the ladies who had entertained the Canadians were now their guests. Mrs. Pope decided to go on to Canada when the conference moved there. Mrs. Coles, wife of the island opposition leader, made plans to go too, and take her daughter, Mercy Ann, with her. The last party was a grand farewell ball in the Colonial Building. The music of two bands, the mirrored reflections from the clusters of globes of lights, evergreens, flags, and flowers transformed the long twin rooms of the council chamber into an enchanted ballroom and a vice-regal reception room where the governor received his guests. There was sherry and claret, tea and coffee, and to end it all, a full formal dinner and hours of speech-making. It was nearly 4 when the party broke, and the delegates, still in evening dress, went aboard the Queen Victoria en route to Halifax by way of Pictou. At Halifax, the Charlottetown Conference made its one great decision. A new conference, whose official subject would be the Confederation of British North America, including Newfoundland, would be held in Quebec in a month's time. In the Halifax Hotel, at a dinner famous for the magnificence of its menu and the significance of its speeches, John A. Macdonald, with a new confidence born of the great decision, said,
"The question of colonial union is of such magnitude that it dwarfs every question on this portion of the continent. It absorbs every idea, so far as I am concerned. For 20 long years I have been dragging myself through the dreary waste of colonial politics. I thought there was no end, nothing worthy of ambition. But now I see something which is well worthy of all that I have suffered in the cause of my little country. This question has now assumed a position that demands and commands the attention of all the colonies of British America. There may be obstructions, local difficulties may arise, disputes may occur, local jealousies may intervene, but it matters not. The wheel is now revolving, and we are only the fly on the wheel. We cannot delay it. The union of the colonies of British America under one sovereign is a fixed fact. The dangers that have risen from the American system we will avoid if we can agree upon forming a strong central government, a great central legislature, a constitution for a union which will have all the rights of sovereignty except those that are given to the local government. If we can only obtain that object, a vigorous general government, we shall not be New Brunswickers, nor Nova Scotians, nor Canadians, but British Americans under the sway of the British sovereign."
Gales thick with snow swooped roaring down the river valley as the little Confederate cruiser Queen Victoria nosed her way up the St. Lawrence with her cargo of maritimers, their wives, and marriageable daughters. She was hard put to it to gain her way at all. On the 9th of October, she brought her passengers into a snowy harbor at Quebec. Mr. Russell's St. Louis Hotel became a home in Quebec for the delegates. Every night the company sat down to what George Brown called company dinner of the first class. Between the banquets, the dinners, the balls, and the déjeuners and supper parties, Mr. Russell's waiters flew about at all hours of the day and night with tea, coffee, and small meals, as well as unlimited supplies of sherry, port, champagne, and brandy. Mr. Whalen, editor of the Charlottetown Examiner, thought that if the delegates could survive the hospitality of the Canadians, they would have good constitutions, perhaps better than the ones they were manufacturing for the Confederation. On October 10th, the Quebec Conference delegates, numbering 33 in all, got down to business. The entire coalition government of 12 ministers formed the Canadian delegation. There were 5 delegates from Nova Scotia, 7 from each of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, and for the first time, 2 from Newfoundland, Messrs. Shea and Carter. As before, each delegation included representatives from both government and opposition parties. It was decided that each province was to have 1 vote, with Canada being given 2 in recognition of its 2 distinct sections. Sir Etienne Taché, the Canadian Premier, was elected chairman. The basis of the discussions that followed was the federal plan which Canadians had first described at Charlottetown, and which was now presented in a series of motions or resolutions. John A. Macdonald rose to move the first and basic resolution.
The best interests and present and future prosperity of British North America will be promoted by a federal union under the Crown of Great Britain, provided such union can be effected on principles just to the several provinces.
Everybody accepted the idea of union in principle, but it was far more difficult to agree about details. At times there were sharp difference of opinion and hot argument. What legislative powers were to be federal and what provincial? What about finance? Where were the provinces to get their revenue when the general government was to be given unlimited taxing powers? How was the Legislative Council, later named the Senate, to be constituted? If representation by population were to be accepted as the basis for the Legislative Assembly, later to be called the House of Commons, would little Prince Edward Island be satisfied with only 5 seats? Should separate schools be safeguarded against the provincial power over education? And how far should the use of the French language be guaranteed? These men who sat in the tall building, set on Quebec's great rock, were not revolutionaries as the Americans had been. They were mid-Victorian British colonials, and proud of it. They sought to keep in the Constitution for their new nation the principles of parliamentary government and constitutional monarchy. This was not simply the British tradition. It was also the British-American tradition. It was their own. On the 19th of October, while the conference was halfway through its labors, the St. Albans raid brought American rage and threat of violent punishment to British North America. The delegates were brought once more vividly aware of their need for a united strength. That note was sounded again and again 2 months later in the Canadian legislature. The weather was appalling in Quebec. Snow gave place to continuous rain. But dances can be held without benefit of fine weather, and night after night the dripping carriages waited to take the fascinated maritime ladies to yet one more ball. Mercy Coles had a dreadfully sore throat, and Dr. Tupper would not let her go to any of the parties after the Governor-General's drawing room until the very last day in Quebec. Mercy Coles reported on Quebec to her diary.
I never saw such a place. There hasn't been 2 hours' sun since we got here. We all went to the drawing room last night. All the ladies looked very well and were quite a credit to the lower provinces. Pa, Ma, and I went together. A half-dozen gentlemen wanted to take me into the room, but I preferred to go in with Papa. The Governor-General stood in the middle of the room with his private secretary on his right hand. We did not require to have any cards. The aides announced us each time. The governor shook hands very friendly with each one. After all those who had the privilege of entree were presented, they formed a half-circle. The rest of the people then walked in at one door and passed out at the other. There were about 800 people. Mr. Tilley took charge of me and walked about with me the whole evening. Ma wore her grenadine over black silk. I wore my blue silk. There were only 2 or 3 trains there.
By the 26th of October, all the details of the federal plan had been discussed, accepted, and set out in order. The great achievement of the Quebec Conference was the passing of 72 resolutions. The 72 Quebec resolutions were to form the basis of an imperial statute uniting the British American provinces. Full of enthusiasm and satisfaction in a job well done, the delegates would take the plan home for approval in their legislatures. But first there was to be the grand tour of the Canadas. George Brown wrote to his wife in Scotland about the conference in Quebec. Let us hear her read the letter.
Toronto, 31st of October, 1864. My dearest Anne, we got through with our work at Quebec famously. The Constitution is not exactly to my mind in all its details, but as a whole it is wonderful, really wonderful. When one thinks of all the fighting we have done for 15 years, and now find the very men who fought us every inch, now going far beyond what we asked, I am amazed and sometimes alarmed lest it all goes to pieces yet. We have yet to pass the ordeal of public opinion in the several provinces, and sad indeed it will be if the measure is not adopted by acclamation in them all. In Upper Canada, we may well light bonfires and build monuments the day it becomes law. Nearly all our past difficulties are ended by it, whatever new ones may arise. I think I wrote you about the entertainments at Quebec. The same sort of thing is now to go off in other places. At Montreal there was a ball, and on Saturday a déjeuner. Today the delegates go up the river to Ottawa, and there they have tomorrow a déjeuner and a ball in the evening. On Wednesday they come on straight through to Toronto.
Toronto gave them a deafening welcome, with little Mercy Coles to tell us about it.
Toronto, Queen's Hotel, Thursday, November 3rd. We arrived here at 10 o'clock. Such a grand affair. Torchlight procession. 5,000 people were in front of the hotel. Dr. Tupper, Mr. Tilley, and Mr. Brown made speeches from a gallery just beneath my bedroom window.
When the traveling was over, the delegates went a little soberly home to win the acceptance by their legislatures of the astounding resolutions they had approved in Quebec. Canada moved first. On the 6th of February, 1865, in the Canadian Legislative Assembly, John A. Macdonald moved the adoption of the 72 resolutions. A long debate followed, for every member wanted to record his opinion on such an important question. In his opening speech, Macdonald explained and emphasized the basic principles of the new Constitution.
I am strong in the belief that we have hit upon the happy medium in those resolutions, in that we have formed a scheme of government which unites the advantages of both, giving us the strength of a legislative union and the sectional freedom of a federal union, with protection to local interests. In the first place, by a resolution which meets with the universal approval of the people of this country, we have provided that for all time to come, so far as we can legislate for the future, we shall have as the head of the executive power the sovereign of Great Britain. I believe that it is of the utmost importance to have that principle recognized, so that we shall have a sovereign who is placed above the region of party, to whom all parties look up, who is not elevated by the action of one party, nor depressed by the action of another, who is the common head and sovereign of all. Ever since the American Union was formed, the difficulty of what is called state rights has existed, and this has had much to do in bringing on the present unhappy war in the United States. They commence, in fact, at the wrong end. They declared by their Constitution that each state was a sovereignty in itself, and that all the powers incident to a sovereignty belonged to each state, except those powers which, by the Constitution, were conferred upon the general government and Congress. Here we have adopted a different system. We have strengthened the general government. We have given the general legislature all the great subjects of legislation. We have thus avoided that great source of weakness which has been the cause of the disruption of the United States. We thereby strengthen the central parliament and make the Confederation one people and one government instead of 5 peoples and 5 governments, with merely a point of authority connecting us to a limited and insufficient extent.
Immediately after MacDonald came George Cartier. He was especially anxious to assure his fellow French Canadians that Confederation would permit a diversity of races and help to preserve the distinct culture of French Canada.
Now, when we were united together, we would form a political nationality with which neither the national origin nor the religion of any individual would interfere. It was lamented by some that we had this diversity of races, and hopes were expressed that this distinctive feature would cease. The idea of unity of races was utopian. It was impossible. Distinctions of this kind would always exist. Look, for instance, at the United Kingdom, inhabited as it was by 3 great races. Had the diversity of race impeded the glory, the progress, the wealth of England? Had they not rather contributed their share to the greatness of the empire, of the glories of the Senate, the field, and the ocean, of the successes of trade and commerce? How much was contributed by the combined talents, energy, and courage of the 3 races together? In our own federation, we should have the Catholic and Protestant, English, French, Irish, and Scotch, and each by his efforts and his success would increase the prosperity and glory of the new Confederacy. We were of different races, not for the purpose of warring against each other, but in order to compete and emulate for the general welfare.
The debate went on. Alexander Galt spoke about the financial arrangements which were chiefly his. George Brown explained the benefits of the Union for Canada West. D'Arcy McGee, the poet, orator, and prophet of Canadian Confederation, dwelt on the dangers that threatened British America if it did not unite.
The policy of our neighbors to the south of us has always been aggressive. There has always been a desire amongst them for new territory. They coveted Florida and seized it. They coveted Louisiana and purchased it. They coveted Texas and stole it. And then they picked a fight with Mexico, which ended by their getting California. Had we not the strong arm of Britain over us, we should not now have had a separate existence. The acquisition of Canada was the first ambition of the American Confederacy, and never ceased to be so when her troops were a handful and her navy scarce a squadron. Is it likely to be stopped now, when she counts her guns afloat by the thousands and her troops by hundreds of thousands?
The debate continued until the 11th of March, but there was never any doubt about the result. The supporters of the coalition government were in overwhelming majority. The Quebec resolutions were passed by 91 to 33. The Quebec scheme was safe in Canada, but in the maritime provinces, the 72 resolutions were meeting strong opposition. The Maritimers were convinced that their representatives would be outnumbered and powerless in the federal parliament. They feared higher taxes. Even the promise of the intercolonial railway failed to satisfy them. The situation was particularly serious in New Brunswick, for there the existing legislature would come to an end in June 1865, and a general election would have to be held. Premier Tilley had scarcely got back to New Brunswick when he became aware that a strong protest against the Quebec scheme was rapidly growing. He wrote about his troubles to George Brown and Alexander Galt.
We will have a hard fight here, many prejudices to overcome. The current of public opinion is against us. Gray and I held the first public meeting on Thursday night, speak again tonight, and tomorrow night. I start in a few days on a stumping expedition through the central counties. We have a large portion of the press against us. We ascertained that a large majority of the members of the House would have opposed the terms of the Quebec Conference. Every paper in the province, without exception, spoke out strongly against legislating upon the subject previous to a general election. I felt that to ask for so great a change in our Constitution without giving the electors a voice could not well be defended.
The general election was held in midwinter before Tilley could tour the province and fully explain the Quebec scheme. Tilley and his Confederates went down to defeat. The plan fared no better in Prince Edward Island. The legislature rejected the Quebec scheme as politically dangerous to island interests. Newfoundland postponed any consideration of the scheme indefinitely. Even in Nova Scotia, the prospects for Confederation grew more and more doubtful. Charles Tupper writes to MacDonald,
"A number of the leading merchants here, many of them supporters of the government, were strongly opposed to Confederation with Canada, and they were joined by several members of the opposition. But it would not have given us the slightest trouble had not Joseph Howe assumed the leadership of the party, allowing his name to be freely used as opposed to the measure. At this conjuncture, when an appeal to the people had been adopted as a war cry, Tilley announced his determination to yield to that demand and followed it up by a dissolution. Had he succeeded, by great sacrifice and exertion, we could, I think, have secured a bare majority. But the moment he failed, I found that all my ingenuity would be required to avert the passage of a hostile resolution."
In the Nova Scotia Assembly, Tupper had managed to remain in power. But in the country, anti-Confederation forces gathered strength. Joseph Howe continued his opposition, first in anonymous newspaper editorials, and then openly in speeches and pamphlets.
Let us see what these Canadians desire to do. They are not, as we have shown, a very harmonious or homogeneous community. 2/5 of the population are French and 3/5 English. They are, therefore, perplexed with an internal antagonism, which, unless the fusion of races becomes rapid and complete, must ever be a source of weakness. They are shut in by frost from the outer world for 5 months of the year. They are at the mercy of a powerful neighbor whose population already outnumbers them by more than 8 to 1. It is evident that a more unpromising nucleus of a new nation can hardly be found on the face of the earth, and that any organized communities having a reasonable chance to do anything better would be politically insane to give up their distinct formations and subject themselves to the domination of Canada.
By the spring of 1865, then, British North American Union seemed to have reached a dead end. The 72 resolutions had been approved only in the Canadas. They had been firmly rejected in 3 of the maritime colonies and shelved in the 4th. But the Canadians were very determined not to turn back. In April, MacDonald, Cartier, Galt, and Brown went to London to canvass the imperial authorities for support for Confederation. Socially and politically, the Canadians had a glorious time in London. They put up at the Westminster Palace Hotel, and everybody who was anybody entertained them, from the Prince of Wales down through the ranks of the peers, financiers, and the cream of the London society. They dined and danced, they drove to the races, to the Derby, and never for a minute in the midst of the gaiety of the London season did they forget why they were there. Night and day they talked of the benefits and advantages of Confederation in British North America. The British government promised to help them persuade the Maritimes to join with the Canadas. Great Britain gave her assurance that in the event of war she would come to Canada's aid with all the resources at her command. The Canadians were satisfied that British North American Union had become an imperial policy. During the autumn and winter of 1865-66, the winds of change of opinion were blowing strongly in the maritime provinces. The Civil War was over, but the wartime disputes between the United States and England had not yet been settled, and the American Fenians, who hoped to strike a blow for Irish independence by conquering British America, were reported to be massing in thousands on the borders of New Brunswick and Canada in the spring of 1866. The Reciprocity Treaty came to an end. There was no hope now of increased trade with the United States, which some had regarded as a possible alternative to Confederation. The anti-Confederate government in New Brunswick grew weaker, more divided, and more uncertain about union. In the spring, it resigned. A new election was held, and Tilley and the Confederates came back into power. The Unionist triumph in New Brunswick gave new strength to Tupper in Nova Scotia. In the Assembly, he proposed that delegates should be sent from Nova Scotia to London to discuss a scheme of union which will effectively secure just provision for the rights and interests of this province. The debate on this motion had just begun when the news arrived that the Fenians, whom everybody had been dreading for weeks, had actually raided a small island off New Brunswick. The great ship HMS Duncan, with 81 guns, crowded with troops and field pieces, sailed from Halifax to St. John, ready to fight the Fenians. In the face of this danger, and with this renewed proof of the value of British protection, the Nova Scotia Assembly passed Tupper's motion. In the autumn of 1866, delegates from Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick met in London to revise the Quebec resolutions. They were greeted by the new colonial secretary, the Earl of Carnarvon, a young man full of enthusiasm for Confederation, who believed in the future greatness of the British colonies. A much smaller company of delegates met in London than had gathered in Charlottetown or Quebec. The London Conference, meeting in the white and gold concert hall of the Westminster Hotel, was made up of only 16 members, 5 from Nova Scotia, 5 from New Brunswick, and 6 Canadians. Tupper and Tilley proposed that MacDonald should be chairman. It was a delicate task, but MacDonald's skill in diplomacy was equal to it. The Canadians were bound to stick to the Quebec scheme. Their legislature had ratified it without alteration, but Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had never accepted the 72 resolutions. They had simply agreed to continue talks for union, and now they wanted a few changes that would make the scheme seem a better bargain financially for the Atlantic provinces. The London Conference did not amend the 72 resolutions in any very important way, but it did increase the subsidies to the provinces. In the following March, the British North America Act passed the Imperial Parliament. By royal proclamation, the act would come into force on July 1st, 1867. It was to be the birthday of a new nation. The feeling was strong with the fathers of Confederation that British North America had come of age. They had turned their backs on pettiness, on provincialism. The new nation had half a continent as its homeland, a new station in the eyes of the world, and a new name. MacDonald expected a healthy and cordial alliance between Great Britain and Canada, which would take the place of the old imperial relationship. He and his colleagues fought hard for the title Kingdom of Canada as the new name. But the British were afraid that the Americans, who did not like even the idea of the Confederation of the British provinces, would be angered. It was important to keep the relations between the Republic and Great Britain as peaceful as possible. So, from the beautiful verse in the 72nd Psalm, "He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth," the Dominion of Canada got its name. When the bill was passed, Lord Carnarvon expressed great satisfaction.
We are laying the foundation of a great state, perhaps one which at a future day may even overshadow this country. But come what may, we shall rejoice that we have shown neither indifference to their wishes nor jealousy of their aspirations, but we honestly and sincerely, to the utmost of our power and knowledge, fostered this growth, recognizing in it the conditions of our own greatness.
On the 1st of July, the day broke fair all across Canada. The little steamer Queen Victoria, brought Lord Monck, the Governor-General of the Dominion of Canada, to Ottawa to set the seal upon it all. John A. Macdonald became Sir John A. Macdonald. There were some who wept, but there were more who sang on this 1st of July. Glorious summer weather spread all across this new Dominion of Canada on its first birthday. The lakes and rivers shone gunmetal blue under the sun, and flotillas of sailboats and canoes and rowboats were scattered abundantly on the waters. Picnickers set up tables under trees in the parks and piled them high with festive food. Bands played and soldiers marched. Children drilled with Union Jacks clutched in their hands. And in the evening, bonfires blazed on the hills, and fireworks reflected their gold fountains in the waters of the lakes. In the dark sky, the symbols of the provinces of this new land blazed in fireworks: a pine tree, a mayflower, and a great, glorious golden beaver. Little newspapers sang their exultant songs. The days of isolation and dwarfhood are past. Henceforth we are a united people, and the greatness of each goes to swell the greatness of the whole. It was thus that the Dominion of Canada was born.